Hey everybody, welcome back to the Words of Life podcast with Adam and Kevin. Our weekly recap is upon us again, and we're really excited. Now, a few days ago, I mentioned that I was looking forward to unpacking the book of Hebrews, which would be the logical choice. But when Kevin and I were talking about this, we decided that in 2024, last year, which is pretty not too far, it was pretty recently, really.
Towards the end of the year, yeah.
Yeah, towards the end of last year, we actually did an exhaustive study, several weeks on the book of Hebrews. And so what I'm going to do instead, I'm just going to go ahead and link the discussions we had on the book of Hebrews, because we really don't think we could do the book real justice in one sitting of 45 minutes, because there's so much in that book to uncover. And it is such an amazing accounting or a case for how awesome the Lord is that we would rather you take more time to really appreciate it than just 45 minutes. That said, though, we started the book of James. Yesterday's last day's reading for this last week, chapters 1 and 2. And the book of James is also pretty great. And we also realized that looking at the schedule, we'll finish James really fast.
Yeah, like
and then we're going to get First and Second Peter, and so we'll have so much material to talk about next week that we figured we will probably miss out on the opportunity to talk about James unless we do it right now. We can obviously just do it James
separate thing
anytime we want.
Sure, right,
but given the pace that we've been setting for ourselves, we thought that would be the most appropriate. So without further ado, and without any other personal conversations, let's just dive right in to the book of James, and I'm going to go ahead and let Kevin start us off with a little bit of background info, and then we'll just take it one point at a time.
Yeah,
at least in the first two chapters for tonight. I think
that's
right.
Great. Tackle the first two, and if we get through them all real fast, we'll see where we get in the back half, right? But yeah, if you look at James, you're thinking about what's going on here, right? Some people suggest this might be one of the earliest writings of the New Testament. That could be the case. A lot of that's based on sort of this intro here: James, the servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Right? It's the kind of opening that really sort of seems like it's written to the church in its infancy, perhaps, right? That hey, I'm writing this out it's written to the believers as you keep reading on, right? It's these that trust in Jesus, but right. It's very Jewish in its address, right? These 12 tribes scattered throughout the many nations. It takes us back to Acts, where all these came from Pentecost, right? From all these nations, and they then left and went home. And so it could be written shortly after that persecution that starts kicking people, and they all kind of leave and go back to their homelands. And so that's just some speculation. Who the author is, James, again, some speculation there. It could be the same James we're reading about a lot in the New Testament. It seems pretty likely, who might have been the Lord's brother, the James that we see in Acts, who's a pillar of the church there in Jerusalem. So that's some of the guesses, if you will, at who this James is. He doesn't list himself any other way other than James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. But that's but most people take to believe is that's who that James is and who it's written to. And you'll see as we go through, there's not a lot of discussion about things that come up a lot in like Paul's writings, right? I mean, if this was written later and he's writing to the 12 tribes scattered amongst nations, you'd expect that he'd talk a lot about circumcision, you don't have to keep the law, and those kinds of things, and none of that is present. And so that's why we think perhaps it's one of the earliest New Testament writings.
That all makes sense. It's very clear that it's very focused on uplifting and encouraging and keeping people on the straight and narrow.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to block or teach against false teaching and things like that. So, yeah, absolutely on point there.
Yeah.
And I think that James also gets tossed around, especially in light of the book of Romans that Paul taught, because Paul's focus there is that we're saved by grace, we're saved by faith, and then James, correlates that. Well, we're show me your faith without works, and your faith is dead, right? And so you've got this surface level contradiction, quote unquote, that's not really a contradiction at all if you understand the in-depth context of both of those books. But if you just match these two concepts up singly by themselves, they don't seem to match up very well. But with greater study, we understand that they're perfectly balanced and all true together.
Yeah, and James is that's another way, it's very different, right? As you talk about this idea of the show me your faith by your works. His the entire text is effectively practical, right?
Yeah.
You don't see the kinds of things you see in some of the other writings of here is the Christology of the book, that being like here's the theological underpinnings of why you ought to do these sorts of things. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but it's not like Paul's writings where you get the first half of the book is about all of these doctrinal sorts of bits and all of this thought about who Jesus is and what he's done and the work he's performed, and then, so because of that, you ought to, right? James is very much practical in its nature, right? When you fall into trials and temptations, act like this, tame your tongue, watch what you say, right? Be careful how, I mean, it's very much, like you say, an encouraging sort of letter to the people, and not encouraging like, hey, rah, you're doing good, but hey, here are things you should do, right? In order to hold on to your faith.
So speaking of which, I've been occasionally drinking Coke Zeros.
Okay.
And I grabbed a Coke today, and I thought it was a Coke Zero, but then I'm feeling kind of funny. I'm like, I look down like, this is not a Zero. This is a regular Coke. I haven't had like this much sugar. I'm basically poisoning myself right now, so I'm just putting that aside. So yes, staying on the straight and narrow is important, people. You got to be careful and
Watch
read
out.
the labels. I don't know why I thought it was a black cap. The black cap is Coke Zero, but
There you go.
that one apparently is not. I'm like, man, I'm feeling kind of funny. It's because,
Tasty and jittery.
yeah, right? Oh, man, that's crazy. All right, so back to the text. Sorry about the little sidebar.
Yeah, no problem.
It's one of those like realizations like this is not okay. But all right. So he jumps almost straight into the context and content. And he's, right, he says, "Hey, greetings to all of the saints in the dispersion, the 12 tribes." And then he says, "Hey, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, because trials give you patience through endurance, and you have to look at the end results and not be bogged down with the present, things that are going on in your life." And so we oftentimes think of that as something that's pretty counterintuitive, and we're right. It's not natural to look at our struggles and our problems in that way. But it's 100% absolutely true. And when you compare that concept and try to find other things, especially in Paul's writings, Peter talks about it. Talks about this fact that we're supposed to be heavenly minded. This mindset we're supposed to have is one where we are able to just completely discredit and discount the things of this world and to be focused on the heavenly. And if we're able to do that, then we can, nothing will faze us in this world.
Yeah, and so that's, again, as we sort of think about why is he starting this way, if our supposition is correct, that these are the people that he's writing to who are in Jerusalem, who are from all the different nations, what causes the people to leave and go back? It's persecution arises in Jerusalem, and they
right out of the gates.
And they leave, right? After some short-ish period of time there, Paul is there, stoning of Stephen, that sort of stuff. It's perhaps a couple of years as much as, but it's not very far, and they're leaving, they're spreading, they're going. And so this letter may be quickly following and say, hey, consider it joy that we've come into this persecution, right? And understand what it's producing in you. And, he says about this thing, as you get down into verse 9 then, that when he says believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, and the rich should take pride in their humiliation, right? I think that's a direct call to the persecution they're suffering, right? And so the persecution they're suffering, hey, if you're humble, if you're poor, if you're lowly, and you're being persecuted for the sake of the kingdom, he says you should count that as, you should exalt in that high position. And what he means by that is just like the apostles when they went and they were drug in before the council, right? And then they leave. It says they were joyous because they were worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. So if you're poor, if you've got nothing, you're in first century Palestine, and no one takes notice of you. But now people are taking notice of you, and they're persecuting you, right? You've effectively you're important enough to get noticed because of the position you take in Jesus Christ. And on the other hand, the rich person who never suffers persecution, hey, you should take pride in this lowering of yourself, this humiliation you're presently suffering, because it doesn't happen to you very often.
Right.
And it's a good reminder for you that your wealth and your time here on earth will pass away, right? It's a good reminder of what's really coming is the end of all this stuff. And so he says, you, if you're wealthy and you're suffering persecution, you should see it as joy because you've been lowered. and it reminds you of your temporal nature. It reminds you you're just a flower that's passing away, right? And so either side you find yourself on, right? You should take joy in that persecution and what it means for your circumstance there.
Yeah. So that passage you were actually, while you were talking about, I thought back to James and John and the apostles when they were imprisoned in Acts chapter, right after they healed the man and the lame man in the temple in chapter 3. Chapter 4, they were imprisoned once. Chapter 5, they were imprisoned again. And then at the end of chapter 5 is what you're talking about. You know, they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and praying Jesus as the Christ. And
and if we think about those men, right, especially if we think about those men, those disciples of Jesus, from a physical standpoint, they are those from humble circumstances. Right? Like they've left all, Peter. We've left everything to follow you, Jesus. Right? And so this is why they take pride now in this suffering that they're going through, and that's why James is going to write this. I mean, you can almost see him visualizing that event happening, and the outcome of it. Now him writing about that and reminding people of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we had Peter and Andrew, who were brothers, and then James and John were brothers.
Yeah.
But Peter and John were oftentimes together. Maybe they were the older brothers.
Could
right?
be.
Although John was faster than Peter, right? Maybe he was the younger of the older brothers. But it's interesting. So I'm assuming the other two were still like close, and they knew about these things. They were all there, right?
Yeah, and this is probably, I mean, if we're talking about James, this is probably James the Lord's brother.
Right.
Another James, besides the 12.
James. Yeah, I get them confused.
But again.
Yeah. But they were all there, working for the Lord,
yeah,
and all witnessing. They were all suffering, being persecuted. So,
because remember, if that's the James we're talking about, he's a pillar of the church in Jerusalem, right, and likely one of the elders there.
Yep.
And so certainly he's suffering and seeing these things firsthand. And if not him personally, then those of his flock, let's say, right, that were there in that city. So this is kind of what he's saying. And so he tells us, right, and this is good for us because we're not suffering that first persecution that he's probably talking about at that time, though it's still valuable for us. Verse 13, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. And this is a pretty famous verse, right, that we have memorized, many of us. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, right? But each person is tempted when he's carried away by his own evil desires and enticed.
Right.
And so that's an important thing to understand or to note or to remember where this temptation is coming from, right? I mean, even when we think of like maybe the most pertinent example might be that of Job, right? God is not the one who does this stuff to Job. Even in that story, he just gives Satan leeway to do it. Satan is the one who does the tempting and the testing there, right? Not God. God does not tempt those with evil things.
Correct. So before we get too much further in there, there's a couple interesting passages in here that about prayer that I don't want to just gloss over.
Yeah.
Right. So when he talks about, after talking about persecution and our attitude towards that, then he talks about lacking wisdom. If anyone lacks wisdom, you're supposed to ask God for wisdom with faith and trusting in the fact that it will be given to him, right? But here's what I find pretty interesting. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts, right? Then he goes on to have this analogy here is like the wave of a sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. He who doubts is unstable. And you can see that makes a lot of sense. It resonates well with me. Those who are doubtful, you're unsure, right? If you're unsure. This is saying we're supposed to approach the throne of God with confidence and assurance that God will give us what we need, especially wisdom, which is what he's specifically talking about here.
Yeah, and if you're doing the reading, right, then that should sound familiar because just this week we read in Hebrews, right, about this idea of approaching the throne of grace for help in times of need, right? We boldly approach the throne and we find mercy there in a time of our struggle or need. And that's what he's talking about here, right? You're struggling in persecution, approach the throne of grace and mercy, right? And you'll find what you need there. And you approach boldly, not doubting that God will give you those things.
Right. But this idea of understanding that we are lacking is also another important concept. the American culture that we live in is all about self-sufficiency these days. And us being able to accomplish things and then be strong and be, overcome the challenges and all these things. Well, this next verse here in verse 9, letting the lowly brother exult in his glory in his exaltation. What exaltation is that? It reminds me of, we actually just talked about this in class at our local Bible study, talking about Paul and his own weakness, that Paul said he had this thorn in the flesh, and he asked God 3 times to remove this thorn in the flesh. And his response, what the Lord said to him is, "No, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So Paul's weakness was then utilized to glorify God. Paul understanding that he wasn't going to be made physically perfect, so that he could reflect more properly the characteristics of Jesus and serve Jesus in a better way. Because if Paul, being as intelligent as he was, if he was also good-looking and charismatic and an amazing speaker, if he had the triple threat of Broadway, right? If he could sing and he could dance and he could act and he looked really good, right? If he had all those things, it would be Paul getting the glory all the time.
Yeah.
But Paul's weakness, whatever it was, whether it was his eyesight, whether it was just, I don't know, homely looking, he was probably pretty beat. He obviously was beat up a lot.
At least at some point in his life,
he was scarred. I'm sure he's probably kind of disfigured us a little bit from how many times he'd been stoned and shipwrecked, right? It's not like they had plastic surgery back then, And so Paul, like Jesus, nothing really to get excited about physically speaking. And Jesus says, "Hey, my power is made perfect in your weakness." And so sometimes we talk about playing to our strengths.
Yeah.
It was a really good point. Brother Zach did a little talk on it on Wednesday night. He said, we oftentimes focus on our talents. We focus on our strengths. But we really should be trying to figure out what our weaknesses are and working at those. Work on our weaknesses and thrive in our weak state, so that Christ can be more exalted through our weaknesses. It's an interesting concept, but understanding that we need God and that we are lacking in things is a good place to start. In understanding that we have weaknesses that Christ can be glorified through.
Yeah. The other way I think about that idea is another verse I think about. It's one of my favorites also in 2 Corinthians there, where you're talking about Paul mentioning the thorn in the flesh. Earlier in chapter 4, he'll talk about we have this treasure in earthen vessels, right, to show that the power, the excellency is from God and not from us, right? That's sort of the way that God intended that to be as they were out there caring about that message of reconciliation. And that's always been God's MO. I mean, you can see that over and over again throughout the Bible. Just think about many of the stories that right? David goes out. He's not just fighting a guy. He's fighting a giant, right? He's not just fighting a giant who's a warrior, and he's a shepherd, and he has nothing, and he picks up a rock, right? Or, I'm going to feed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and with 2 fish, right? Like I'm going to take the least of this, and I'm going to make it into something. Why? To show that the power is of God and not from the one who's doing the thing, right? And that happens over and over again. And so this is nothing new here that is being said, that we're going to be exalted in our weakness, that God's glorified in that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe let's push down to the end of that chapter there, just so we don't get stuck forever. So after he's talking about this idea of trials and temptations and how you handle that and praying and those kinds of things and the good gifts that God gives as opposed to the temptation we get from the world and from the devil, then he starts, again, his next bit of practical advice, let's say, right? If you kind of think about his letter in practical advice sections, you've got, in suffering, and now you've got this listening and doing, right? Is sort of this next piece here. Dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, right? And you'll see a lot this idea in James. A lot of the things that he says, again, because it's very Jewish in its nature and its audience and its author, this sounds like this could be from the Proverbs. Right? Like if you're studying through the Proverbs and you're looking at things, what do you find all the time, right? That the wise man keeps his tongue, but the fool proclaims his folly, right? That you see these kinds of things over. This could fit right in there, right? Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, right? Like this sounds like a proverb of Solomon, right? Effectively. And so he's telling you this is something you should do, right? You should think about listening in not speaking, and we use this even not in religious circles. We teach it to our children, even worldly people will say, hey, it's a wise saying, right? You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So you should listen twice as much as you speak, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing he's saying. Now, his spin is quite different because he says, when you speak, when you're quick to speak, you're probably quick to speak because of anger, right? And anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires, right? So he's really focusing in here on not just listening more than you talk, but especially when things are making you upset, like i.e. persecution you may be suffering. Hey, when you're suffering this persecution, a good idea would be to keep your mouth shut, right? Because you're probably just going to be angry and spout off, and the anger of man does not bring about the righteousness of God, right? And so instead, get rid of all of this other stuff. Get rid of these things and turn towards the word that's been planted in you. Let it do its work. Slow down, let the word do its work, not your own mouth. And that's sort of the approach you ought to take. And so then he'll push into listening more, right? Don't listen to the world, right? Don't just listen to the word and not do it. And so he kind of builds on this whole idea here of listening that he starts right up there in 19 about being quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry.
Yeah, it also talks about the implanted word,
Yeah.
which is able to save your souls. And so this idea of being quick to hear also is an important trait for us as students of the Word. We really should be paying much more attention to the Word, which will save our souls. And so we have to be good listeners of the Holy Bible and God's message to us. And obviously that's part of it, being slow to speak,
Yeah.
quick to hear.
And you can again picture this metaphor, this parable of Jesus, the sower who goes out to sow, right? And what is the seed? The seed is the word of God, right? And what does it do? It takes root. It implants itself in this, and it brings forth fruit, right? At least those with whom it implanted and not carried away or any of those kinds of things, right? And so you can see that picture coming up here, right? That the word is the seed, plants down in you, and it brings forth this fruit. What kind of fruit? The fruit of righteousness that God desires. That's the fruit that it's gonna bring forth there.
Well, that's what he talked about in verse 17 and 18, right? Chapter 1 there.
Yeah.
Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, right? So the whole goal is that we are supposed to be the first fruits brought forth through the word.
Yeah. And then, lest you think he says only listen, right? Now he's going to start getting into this idea that we're going to see developed more as we go into the next chapter and stuff as well. Don't merely listen to the word, right? Because, I'm going to be quick to listen. Unless you just say, okay, good, that's what I'm going to do. He immediately follows it up. But make sure you're listening because you're going to do something, right? Don't just listen to the word and deceive yourself, but instead do what it says, right? Anyone who listens to the word but doesn't actually do it is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and immediately goes and forgets what kind of person that he was, right? And so the picture there is this idea of, looking in the mirror and making corrections, right? As opposed to just looking in the mirror and then walking away. We were talking beforehand, right? Because you'd asked about, I said, no, I just, every couple of weeks when my hair gets too long, I set my clippers on one and shave everything. Beard, mustache, neck, head, the whole bit, right? Why? Because I don't want to spend a lot of time looking in the mirror and fixing this hair and that hair and the other, right? And so, most of my time, I don't look in the mirror. I just move along and move along and move along. And I walk past it every morning, right? Several times I walk past the mirror. And I'm sure I see myself in it as I walk past. But this is the picture he's saying, right? I just walk past and I forget what kind of person I was. I didn't make any corrections. I didn't stop and say, let me fix that and do whatever, right? Now, my wife, on the other hand, when she gets ready in the morning, right, she's looking in the mirror and she's doing the stuff. She's, doing all the things. She's doing something with that mirror, right? And so that's what he's saying, right? You do something with that word. That word is a mirror, right? That law of liberty is this mirror. And if you use it in such a way that you do something about yourself, right? You do the things that it says, you make those corrections, then that's useful. But if you're just like me, walking past the bathroom mirror every morning because you don't care, then, that's what some people do with the word of God, right? They read it, they move on, they go about their day, they put it on plaques around their house.
Well, it's interesting that, and I don't know, well, we always make correlations to the things that we've heard or studied recently, right?
Sure,
so they're always making these connections. So one of our elders gave a sermon on Sunday talking about who is the believer of John 3:16.
Okay.
John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Right? And so, well, what does it mean? Who is the what does it
One
mean
who
to
believes
believe
in him, right?
in him? And so he went through the scriptures, and he really brought out a lot of verses that talked about people believing, but who were not saved.
Yeah.
So one of those groups, actually, where there were some of the elders of the temple that believed in him, but for fear of the other church leaders, didn't actually take any action on that belief. Right? So there's belief on a theoretical, or what's the word I'm looking for? Intellectual level. There's intellectual belief, and then there's real belief that results in action.
Yeah, and that's right. You could even take it very simply, right? Because there are certainly people who believe that Jesus existed, right? Like,
he talked about the demons believed.
Sure. But you can find people all the time who believe, I believe that Jesus was a real person, right? Okay, so do you believe in Jesus? Yeah, I believe in Jesus. I believe he was a real person, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's not what he's talking about here, right? He's talking about believing in him, right?
Yeah.
And not just believing things about him.
Yes.
And so, that's kind of this important sort of thought there that you're addressing, right?
Well, yeah, so those who are believers will be doing the word.
Right.
And not just hearing and intellectually understanding that is a truth. And so that's James's real point, that believers you will know them by their fruits. And so the fruits of righteousness which will be evident because you are a believer. And then so James is going to actually make this really great argument about the fact that you cannot have real faith without works.
Yeah, and his thing that's interesting as he talks about this idea here, right, that they're going to the one who does, and then he's going to give you very specific things, and he's going to sandwich these things in between these two sections that you've talked about, right, which he talks about here. Don't be listeners, but doers also. And then in chapter 2, the end of that chapter, he's going to come back to this idea, and sandwiched in between there are some things, right? And so these are the kinds of things I suspect he's thinking about, right, that you ought to be doing in the Word, right? And so the first one that he's going to bring up is those who consider themselves to be religious but don't keep a tight rein on their tongues, right? They deceive themselves and their religion is worthless. Right, and so one of the things he's going to say is like the way you speak, right, is an indication of whether or not you're doing the word, right? If you're not speaking in the right way and speaking the right things, if you can't keep a grip on your tongue, and especially probably thinking back to 18, 19, and 20 there, 19 and 20, if your tongue is prone to spouting out in anger, then your religion is worthless, right? Like that's not what it's about, because, or as again the Proverbs say, you are a fool, right? And when you go back and you look at the Proverbs, especially, foolishness and wickedness are almost synonymous with each other in the Proverbs, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And you're seeing the same idea here, right? And so one of these things he says is the righteous man, the one who is a doer of the word, the one who's looked at the law of liberty and said, I'm going to make corrections in my life, is the one who controls his tongue, especially in matters of speaking in anger, right? Mm-hmm. Important thing. Then we'll get to this next one. Look after orphans and widows in their distress. This is what it is to be a doer of the word, right? That you take care of these ones who are oppressed. If you're not doing that, and certainly if you're going to the other extreme and persecuting these ones, but even if you're just neglecting them, can't claim religion, right? You can't claim to be someone who's a Christian. Mm-hmm. If you're not doing these things. And then as he puts in the next chapter, he'll talk about favoritism, right? And so these ideas here about controlling the tongue, looking out for the oppressed, specifically the widows and the orphans in this case, and not showing favoritism, this is what James has in his immediate context of
he also throws a little one in there about keeping yourself unstained,
unspotted from the world,
right? He throws it in there as well,
Yeah, and so he has these things that he's thinking about, right, when he's telling them to be doers of the word, right? Mm-hmm. And this is what he wants them to be thinking and considering as he does that. And again, those are always good practical things for us to be mindful of. If we're correct on the purpose and time and writing of this book, you can see how those are extra applicable. If you're suffering persecution, be careful how you talk, right? If the body is suffering persecution, we need to be looking out for the widows and for the orphans, right? If we're suffering persecution in the early days of the church, do not show favoritism to the rich and the wealthy man and ignore the poor and the needy man, right? Like, you can see why these would be especially practical in James's mind, given his current circumstance, though they're certainly applicable at all times to the body, right? Like, that's not like they were only valuable then. Yeah,
I really like the idea that he just throws in the middle this contrast between that Coke is really messing me up. I'm like so like my tongue is way too fast, or my brain is way too faster than my tongue is right now.
Yeah.
It's driving me nuts. Anyway, this contrast between the rich man and the poor man.
Yeah.
He says, why would you honor the rich man anyway? Isn't he the one that's going to take you to court all the time and drag you before the magistrates and all this kind of stuff? And then he says, has not God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom?
Yeah.
Why is that? Why has God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith?
Yeah.
Is it because they have nothing in this world that's good to distract them, that God comes into their life and their life is so much better that they're just so much more abundantly rich in faith? I mean, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah.
And I think those who have been brought out of such lowly physical states into the perfect peace of God are much more appreciative, maybe.
Yeah, and there's this, I don't. As you think about this, like, is this the reason, right? There's lots of ways to sort of think about that idea. But 1 Corinthians chapter 1 has something to say about this, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 1 will tell us about that God has. He says, look, there Paul will actually say, look around and consider. Not many of you are wise by human standards, not many of you rich, not many of you influential, not many of noble birth, right? But God chose the lowly things or the foolish things of this world to shame the wise, the weak things to bring to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised thing and the things which are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one can boast before him, right? And so when Paul is picking up this idea that James is addressing here, that's kind of what he says as far as the why, right? That God has specifically chosen the poor, the lowly, the non-influential, the humble circumstance people in order to demonstrate, again, his power, in order to demonstrate the counterculture, in order to demonstrate and show the wise of this age, you're not so smart, right? You're not as smart as you think you are. It's kind of that same thing Paul says in 2 Corinthians that we were talking about before, right? That in weakness, God's glory is magnified. And so that could be the why, right? From God's motivational standpoint, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I really love. I saw a clip of Dave Ramsey. Somebody called, Dave Ramsey, the financial planner guy, right? And he's a believer. I don't know exactly to what level, but he believes in God, and he says, listen, God doesn't care. This is his answer. Does God want us to be rich? Was this answer the question given to him?
Yeah.
And Dave Ramsey basically says, God doesn't really care. But what God wants is to be put first in your life, no matter what. So if you can handle being a good steward of all the things that God has given you, and God blesses you with more so that you can do more of it, if your attitude is always, God, thank you so much for blessing me, it's all yours, what good should I do with it? Yeah, if you're able to handle wealth, great. If poverty is in the way of you being able to put God first, that's a problem.
Right.
And you know what? God will solve that for you, right? And so I thought it was a really good answer in terms of our attitude towards poor or rich. But if we're able to put aside the concerns with the physical, that seems to be a prevalent idea throughout the New Testament, that God will be enabled more to be worked through us, if I said that right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right, we will be able to be better workers for the Lord in every circumstance. If our attitude is one of which, like, listen, it's all yours, Lord. Work through me. We have to let go, right? So there's a common saying that's been popping up in my head as I study: let go and let God.
Yeah.
We just finished the book of Galatians, and then now we're in the first part of Ephesians, and that concept is there. That Paul says, hey, we just have to be looking to God in all things. So yeah, it's here in James,
Yeah, and I like this idea. I mean, this is probably relevant for us in the present as much as anything. As I'm looking through the book of James, right, I'm trying to figure out what's the most relevant for the here and now, right? This beginning of chapter 2 is, it could be written to us today, right?
For sure.
We have a real problem lately in our churches of looking at people, and in fact, looking at people who we know are worldly atheists. We know this about them. They're self-professed, but who are wealthy, and saying, oh man, what a good guy that is. Look at all the good things he's doing. And you're like, This is what he's talking about right here. Do not esteem that man who has wealth just because he has wealth. That's the same guy who's going to drag you into court when you get in his way. He cares nothing for you. What are you thinking, right? I was preaching out of Psalm 49 this past Sunday, and again, not thinking about James, having not read it yet when I was preparing that sermon. And in that thing, it's talking about, in that psalm, he's talking about, don't be overawed with the wealthy man, it says there. Don't look at his houses, don't look at his things, because guess what? He's going to die just like everybody else. And the rich man who has no understanding of God is no better than a dog, effectively. He's a stupid beast, right? He might as well be an animal that gets hit on the road. They all die. His money does nothing. It doesn't preserve his life. You can't. The value of human life cannot be redeemed with God. There's nothing you can give for it, right? And so his point there is, do not be overawed, and that's effectively what James is saying here in the New Testament, right? Do not, when this one comes in to your assembly, and he's saying if one comes into your assembly, don't show favoritism in this way. Certainly, all the more if they're blatant disbelievers in God, right? Or their actions demonstrate that they're just hearers of the word and not doers of it, right? But we have a problem in our present society, even amongst the churches, of saying that man is wealthy, he must know, he must be smart, he must be good, he must be whatever, and giving favoritism to him because of his position of wealth. And James is saying, don't do that. Yep. Don't do that, right? You should instead esteem the lowly man, right? And look to raise him up. That's the royal law found in Scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so that's a key thing for me to be mindful of, certainly, and keep checking myself on every time, a new thing comes out in the news every other day, right? About people in wealth and power and privilege right now, right? And people going, oh man, no, don't do that. Don't do that, right? That's
yeah.
If nothing else, it's the first step towards idolatry, right? Like, don't do that.
Well, this idea, what is it called? The royal law.
Yeah.
Right? That you shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
One of the things this has also been coming up almost every study recently. The loving your neighbor as yourself. We were talking at the end of Galatians about bearing one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, right? Well, sometimes you can't bear one another's burdens because your own burdens are too heavy. Sometimes your own burdens are too heavy because you haven't learned how to love yourself yet. How can you love your neighbor if you don't love yourself? Right. Sometimes people have, modern day we call it low self-esteem or depression, or things like that. And those are absolutely real things that people struggle with. And so we who are spiritual are supposed to restore such a one. But there are ebbs and flows in all of our lives where sometimes we're going to be strong and we're going to have enough strength to help one of our brothers with their own loads. Now, that's a spiritual load. Sometimes in the prime of our life, we should be definitely bearing the physical burdens of our brethren and everybody else. It says, especially those of the household of faith.
Right.
But this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, we rarely ever talk about the as yourself part of that. But that's a critical part because we have to get healthy and have our relationship with God to a point where we are then able to carry our own load because we've given it to Jesus, right? And really, it's Him carrying it for us, but we're just His yoke is easy, right? And His burden is light. So if we're able to give all of our cares to Jesus and unburden ourselves, we then, through the Lord, can then help other people with their burdens so that they can also get to that point where they've given it all to the Lord. Anyway, sorry, it's a little rabbit hole, but I think it's all applicable to what's being talked about here, in terms of showing partiality and then looking to widows and orphans and, keeping ourselves unspotted from the world. They all are interconnected.
Yeah, for sure. So as he talks on those three things in there, he's going to then push into this other bookend, right, as we would say, at the end of chapter 2. Then is, okay, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, that they claim faith but have no deeds, right? So that's going back to his thing of being a hearer of the word and not a doer, also. So he's bookended this idea with those examples, and so he's now gonna really. I mean, this is as close as you get to intellectual argument, right? Or a this is the reason why to do sort of thing, as you're going to get in James here, right? He's going to give you, let me give you an example with, right? And so he's going to say this idea, right? You have to have deeds that accompany your faith. Otherwise, you have nothing, right? And he gives us key examples, right? If someone has no clothes or food and you say, go in peace and be fed, but you give them nothing, then, that does nothing.
You've done nothing.
You've done nothing. And, I'm going to get a little bit on the edge here, perhaps, of we have this saying that gets thrown around a lot in our modern day. Anytime some catastrophe happens, we're sending our, hopes and prayers, or our prayers and our thoughts and prayers, right? Okay, did you do anything though? Because if you just sent thoughts and prayers, then this is exactly what James is saying, right? What James is saying is, I see someone who is in need. I see someone, a brother or sister has no clothes, has no food, and I say, my thoughts and prayers are with you, brother, but I do nothing for them. Then he says, what good is that? Right? And so we don't want to downplay the importance of prayer, but we use that phrase a lot as I'm not going to do anything, but I'm doing the most important thing, right? No, you just don't want to do anything, right? It is kind of the thought that gets used. And so, if we're not doing something to help those in need, if you're just using that phrase to be like, oh, I gave at the office, then, that is good for nothing, is what James is saying, right? And so we need to be very careful and mindful of that if we use that phrase. If we're using that phrase, you're in my thoughts and prayers, and then my thoughts lead me to go do something to help you, fine, right? But if you just say it and you move along, you're James 2:14 and 15, right? You're that person, right, who he's talking about. And so he says, watch out for that. That is good for nothing. And so in the same way, now that's just his example. That says you should just understand this. This is basic understanding. Then he says, in the same way, faith by itself is, when it's not accompanied by action, is dead. It does nothing, right? And so it's a key important idea he wants us to understand, right? That those two things have to be coupled together. And this is where this thing has become this false dichotomy in Christian thought, right? That there are deeds, or there are works, and there is faith, and they are separated in some way, and you can only have one or the other. But what James's point is that no, they are inextricably linked, right? Mm-hmm. And both ways. If you say I have faith and I have no works, that's good for nothing. And if you do works without faith, that's good for nothing either. Right? Like, they have to go together. And we know that's true because the examples he gives, right? And this is what I think is super fascinating about his examples, because he gives us two examples. And his examples are
Abraham.
Abraham and Rahab. Or to put it another way, his two examples are human sacrifice and national treason. Those are his two examples of all the examples he could have picked in the whole Bible story. He picks these two.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's an interesting choice, right? I'm suggesting the reason he does that is because he wants you to also see deeds without faith is worthless also, right? If Abraham just went and killed his son, God was not going to be pleased, right? If you betray your country and turn, right? That's not a good thing either, right? But he's saying, but when you couple them with faith, because it's done with faith in God, now it becomes a pleasing thing that furthers the plan of God, right? Abraham offering Isaac, coupled with faith, furthered God's plan for mankind. Rahab betraying her own nation and sending the spies away, coupled with faith in God, furthered God's plan for his people and fulfilling the promise of the land, right? Those two things working together is what accomplished God's purpose. But without each other, neither of them's any good. And so it's curious that he picks those two examples. I don't think it's by chance, right, that he's doing that. And so he pulls those out there. And his point is, right, that you have to, Abraham was considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac, right? Yes, it was accounted to him as righteousness because he believed in God. But if he hadn't taken Isaac up to the mountain to offer him, but he said, but God, I believe that you want me to do it, but I'm just not going to. Right, then God would have never said, now I know that, you truly believe in me and will withhold nothing from me.
And in both stories, we often hear this modern phrase of a leap of faith.
Yeah.
Well, when I think of a leap of faith, it's almost like God has promised to catch me when I fall, so I'm just going to jump and trust that God will do what he said he was going to do. And in Abraham's case, God had previously promised and your son will be the son of promise. Yeah. I want you to sacrifice him. And we know through the book of Hebrews, which we just read, that Abraham knew, or he thought, without really without any understanding or any knowledge of God ever doing that before, he just supposed God will raise him from the dead if this is the case, because he promised that my son would be the one.
Right.
So that leap of faith was that I trust that God will fix it if I go through with this command.
Yeah, because he's already promised this.
Rahab had the same kind of leap of faith. I've heard of the God of Israel.
I've seen the things that he's done.
I've seen the things that he's done. They say that I will be safe if I do this thing. I'm trusting in God. And that trust in God led them to both be, in the example that James uses here, as the prime examples of faith with works.
Yeah.
And so, in the end, it really helps to define what faith really is trusting in God's promises for the future, yet unseen.
Yeah, and so it's a real powerful argument that he makes here, right? That these two things go hand in hand. That there is no, and I might even go a step farther. I think that James's real argument is effectively that there is no such thing as faith without deeds. Right? That there is no such thing. You cannot have faith without having the deeds that back it up. If you don't, you don't have faith, right? Because he would say it's a dead faith. Well, what's a dead faith? It's no faith at all, right? Is really his point there, right? It's dead. So if it's dead, it's worthless. It doesn't exist, right? And so he's saying you can't do that, right? And so he says you gotta put these things together in order, as he says here, because when you go down into that example, right, it's curious the way he lays it out. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not Abraham our father considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? So that's the doing, right? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, there it is, and his faith was made complete by what he did, and the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was counted as righteousness. So again, it wasn't the sacrifice itself that was important, right? It wasn't just the offering of Isaac, because it doesn't say Abraham offered Isaac and it was credited for righteousness. It said Abraham believed God and it was credited as righteousness, right? So the way he demonstrated his belief in God was by doing what God had said. Right. God said, offer your son Isaac, and Abraham believed God. What does he mean he believed God? He offered Isaac. Mm-hmm. Right? And those two things together, that's when we say, well, Abraham believed God and it was credited as righteousness. Right. Yes. He did it.
How did he prove that he believed God?
And it's not even that he proved his belief of God. It's the only way you can believe God is to do the thing he says. Yes. If you don't do the thing he says, you don't have faith. Right? Like that's the key argument of James. If you don't do the thing he says, you really don't have faith. Right?
Yeah. I mentioned this before. There's, the modern day philosopher, wise guy, Jordan Peterson, when asked if he believes in God, if you've ever seen that recording of his answer, it's really profound because he pauses. What I love about Jordan Peterson, he's very quick to speak or quick to hear, very slow to speak, because he really contemplates his answers prior to speaking. He's very careful with what he says. And he says, how can you answer that question? Really, how can anyone answer that question? I live as if I believe in God.
Okay.
Right? And I'll try to find it. Maybe I can link it as well in the show notes. But this whole concept of God, the creator of the universe, who has authority to judge me and my soul for eternity. If I believe that he exists and that he is real, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, as we read in the scriptures. If I believe it, then I better be living in a way that says, I believe. I'm living as if there is a God.
That's right.
Just like James is talking about right here.
That's right. And so this is this idea then that we have to understand, right? The body without the spirit is dead. Faith without work, without deeds is dead as well, right? They have to go hand in hand. And it's the way, I like the way he says that there, that those things, 22, his faith and his actions were working together and were made and were made complete by what he did, right? That they have to go hand in hand.
Yep.
So, all right. Well,
absolutely. Well, yeah, we're out of time. Two chapters. That's it. That's all you get, folks. No, that's a great study. The book of James is awesome, and we look forward to finishing the reading of the book of James. If you have any questions about, maybe we'll try to start next week with just finishing James.
Yeah, we can
we'll also have First and Second Peter, but we'll definitely try to highlight some of that. If you have any questions though about any of the things talked about in the first two chapters, we'd love to hear from you. But yeah, great stuff in here. How do you want to end it, Kev? A little, little admonition, little encouragement.
Yeah, I would just say, as you go out this week and you're thinking about what you're doing in your life and what you're walking around doing, right? Think about the things that James has said of what that true religion looks like, what it means to actually be a doer of the word and not a hearer, right? And so when you go through your week this week, consider and think about, how you speak, right? And what that looks like, especially when you speak in anger, how you take care of those who are the less fortunate, the oppressed, the orphan, the widow. How are you doing that this week? And in what way are you showing favoritism to others, especially those who are wealthy, and get those things in line with what James is talking about here, right? Don't just hear this on Tuesday morning or whenever you listen to it and go like, oh, that was good, and go about your day, right? Think about it and do something, right?
Yeah, live as if you believe
Yeah.
in God. So I like that a lot, and that's what James says. Faith without works is dead, so go out and do something about it. All right. God bless everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.